The Admiral was a sailor of the old school, born in a time when crew commanded ships and not the other way around. Now, at the end of his journey, he lay dry and sunburnt on the deck of a half-sunk gumbark of the previous century. This was the largest ship in his admiralty. Even half underwater, it sat a deck taller than the rest. And the forward quarter of the starboard afterdeck bore a makeshift sun shelter erected by some previous tenant of the ill-fated trade vessel. A soft flapping noise and the brush of hair across his face roused the mariner from his midday drowse. He groaned and pulled the torn lace tablecloth off from his sun-browned body. Dour and disconsolate, he forced one eye open. Then he heard it again, the soft flap of sails, a slight croaking of old timbers, and a thrill of excitement came over him. "Worm's favor! He speaks Zephyr!" The mariner's voice rasped from long weeks of disuse. No wind had blown in the Broodcon Sea for he didn't know how long. It may as well have been forever. Kicking aside the tent flap, he scrambled out onto a deck bleached white from the sun's relentless glare. The fleet, as he had jokingly named it in the days when he still had hope enough to joke, was a ghost fleet. It was a flotilla of lost ships and mats of seagrass. Ketch, cutter, catamaran, stonekeel, and war canoe, all empty. There were 100 or more ships of all shapes and sizes, all kinds and descriptions, and all of outdated design. Some unsinkable stonekeels were even more ancient. If one were to dive into the unfathomable depths of the Broodcom, one might, on reaching some impossibly deep seabed, find millennia of vessels, all having floated for a time before giving in to rot, or shipworms, or the tampering of sargassum gnomes, and ultimately finding their way to the lightless depths to rest among the keelboards and bones of crewmen. To say they were abandoned vessels would also be untrue. These sailors had died afloat, by thirst or hunger, or the violent spasms that rack a crew in those last desperate hours. Still more died of sharksbane, bitterweed, and blood kelp, those noxious plants that grow in calm waters and tempt mariners desperate enough to eat leaves from the sea. But this one mariner would not die by thirst or hunger, or lack of sea lore. His school of sailing was a practical one, and the old sailing shanties spoke aplenty of the feared western corner of the Northern Ocean and the many small dangers of the Broodcom. But half of prudence is timeliness. Not wasting a moment, he leapt to the webbing and began to climb to the great gumbark's crow's nest. His spirits rising with each foothold, he began to hum a tune. Soon he was singing, dry voice rising through the stillness in a boastful tenor. "Oh, should the sun sit bright and high and the winds blow without end, I'll tie my line to the tail of the worm and I'll sail the skies with him. But if the sun should pass me by and the winds flee from my ship, then I shall walk the eel's black road upon the sea to swim." Halfway up the mizzenmast, he could survey the fleet. He crawled along a spar until he reached the mast itself and looked about. There was no movement, no wind. "He waits patient, and so shall I," he said. Then he hummed another song and thought of the dragon turning, year upon year. He sang the last of the verse and raised an imagined toast toward the gyre. "Brothers in waiting, though I've no goddess to wait for, no children would know me." He sighed and slumped against the timber, sitting on the spar. Bare, swollen feet swung below him. The mariner rested, but for watchfulness. Another watched him, though he did not notice. No movement, no fish leaping, no gnomes in the floating sargass. The water, as far as he could see, was flat and deepest blue. Then it came, a fleck of gold in the vast blue emptiness of the brewed calm sky. The dragon feather glittered and shined, flashing sunlight as it wheeled in the air and tumbled as if pushed along by a great bellows. "A blessing, too!" he cried out and leapt to his feet, balancing upon the narrow spar. He held a line and leaned into the stale air. The whirlwind. He breathed deeply, closing his eyes, feeling the slightest breeze. One of the telltales fluttered on the mast. He watched the feather, still high up in the column of air, and marked its course in the telltale's lead, then hopped off, rappelling down the mast and hitting the deck at a run. There were no things to grab except a small jug of water and a blade by the hatch as he leapt over the rail and off the bark, landing on the deck of a merchant junk. 3 strides later, leaping to the stone keel cutter, where a rope on the spar made an easy swing to reach an old broadloom trireme, the bones of the old crew still seated at the oars. His old bones had young energy in them as he bounded from one deck to the next, clearing the breadth of his one-man flotilla in a matter of minutes, all the while watching the feather that whirled overhead. There was the one functional ship in the fleet of ghosts, a modest, short-rigged schooner he had restored some time ago and tied on the near side in hopes that someday a breeze might come. He'd almost forgotten those days. They seemed so long ago. He wondered if it was still in working order. Sure enough, the feather drifted in the direction of the ship. As it passed over his head, the mariner could feel the whirlwind's almost imperceptible touch. The gyre winds came close behind it, the first hint of a real breeze. The noises it made, the creaking and groaning of the fleet as the gust passed over, were like the sounds of a graveyard come to life. The admiral heard something snap, and one of the old fragile ships went under. No time to look, no time to waste. He cut the line that held the schooner, leapt aboard, and threw himself upon the halyard to raise the mainsail, not waiting to see if the wind would hold, not checking his supplies below to see if they had spoiled or if the old caulking had let in water. The feather was floating low above the water, small puffs of air kicking it back up before it touched the sea. The admiral raised another sail and felt the wind catch. The boat lurched in the direction of the feather, and he raced to the stern to grab the tiller and steer it true. The feather spiraled up again, shimmering in the midday sun like gold spilling into the air, and the schooner flew after it. He lashed the tiller in place and raised the jib, then the staysail, as much canvas as quick as he could to catch every last puff of breeze in the air. Just then, the feather turned and cut back. The sails flapped loosely, and the blessing flew by, sailing over his head. He reached up, but missed it. The old mariner was not a fool, but a blessing was a blessing, and not to be ignored or let go. It floated behind him, finally spiraling down until it drifted over the water again. He growled a curse for what he knew was the first foolish thing he had done since his stranding. He lashed the tiller to the side so the boat would turn up into the wind and lose speed. He cinched the sheet in tight and loosed the halyard to let the breeze go for a moment. Then, turning and spying it still dancing in the air just above the water, he ran back and jumped over the rail. A short swim and he'd found it. His dragon's blessing. It teased him and blew back into the air as he swam after it. Finally, it had teased enough. The playful whirlwind abated, and the feather settled down, drifting languidly into the admiral's outstretched hand. "Never let a blessing pass you by," he chuckled and spat salt water out, looking to see that the boat had indeed slowed, rounded up, and fallen off from the wind, waiting for its captain to return and free the tiller. But it was not to be. A fin cut through the waters between he and the schooner. "Aye, there's the hitch," he chuckled and paddled to keep his head afloat, one hand still held high to keep the feather dry. "We're winds, or it weren't my blessing after all." The old sailor looked to his schooner again. It wasn't far. The fin circled again, the tail giving the water between he and the schooner a playful thrashing, and then it dove down underneath. He had waited this long on a sea with no wind. Now, with the feather, his fate literally in hand, there was no point in hurrying the inevitable. He hummed the bars of the old shanty and paddled toward the schooner that he knew he would never reach. Oh, should the sun sit bright and high and the winds blow without end, I'll tie my line to the tail of the worm and I'll sail the skies with him. But if the sun should pass me by and the winds flee from my ship, then I shall walk the eel's black road upon the sea to swim. Another gust swirled the empty water, whisked around the hull of the bright trim schooner, filling the sail. The rudder jerked, but the ship fell off and lost the wind. A second gust, and the loop slipped off from the tiller. With the rudder free, the sails filled. The ship sailed off on its own, away from the gyre, the flats of Sargassum, and the stale, ghostly fleets of the brood calm sea.